The Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Right, by Atul Gawande. Picture this. Halloween night in San Francisco. A guy stumbles into the emergency room after some drama at a costume party. He's been stabbed. Now, when surgeons hear stab wound, their brains immediately start playing the worst-case scenario game. 1,000 possibilities flash through their minds, each one worse than the last. But this case, it actually looked pretty routine. The guy was conscious, maybe a bit tipsy, but his vitals were solid. The wound was just a clean 2-inch slit across his belly. Barely any bleeding. The trauma team performed their examination like a well-oiled machine, checking him head to toe, monitoring everything, doing it all by the book. They figured they had time. No need to panic. They could take this slow and steady. Then something changed. A nurse noticed the patient had gone quiet. His drunken rambling just stopped. His heart rate exploded. His eyes rolled back. Within seconds, his blood pressure became almost unreadable. The calm shattered instantly. Suddenly, they're racing to the operating room. Stretcher flying down the hallway, nurses sprinting alongside, the surgeon grabbing his scalpel and making one decisive slice down the man's abdomen. When he opened him up, blood erupted like a geyser. It was everywhere. This wasn't some simple stab wound at all. The weapon had plunged more than a foot deep, past the intestines, straight into the aorta, that massive highway of an artery, carrying blood directly from the heart. The team had done almost everything right. They'd followed every protocol, monitored every vital sign, but in that deceptively calm moment, amid what seemed like simplicity itself, everyone had missed one crucial question. Nobody asked about the weapon. They never asked the patient. They never asked the paramedics what exactly had stabbed him. Turns out, the guy at the party wasn't wearing some cheap pirate costume with a plastic sword. He was dressed as a soldier, and his weapon wasn't a knife. It was a bayonet. Here's the thing about that story. It's not about incompetent doctors. These were some of the best medical professionals in the world, giving their absolute best effort. And that reveals something truly unsettling about our modern world. We possess more knowledge, more skill, more sophisticated technology than at any point in human history. Yet we still screw up. And we screw up in ways that break your heart, because so many of these failures could have been prevented. The guy who wrote this book, Atul Gawande, is a world-renowned surgeon who also writes for The New Yorker and won a MacArthur Genius Grant. He spent his entire career on the front lines where complexity meets life-or-death stakes. And he became obsessed with one profound question. In our incredibly complex world, how do we actually get things right? The answer he discovered isn't some cutting-edge technology or billion-dollar innovation. It's a tool so simple, so humble, it almost feels insulting. But this thing has the power to prevent catastrophes, master complexity, and completely transform how we tackle difficult challenges. By the time we're done here today, you won't just understand this tool. You'll see the entire world differently. You'll grasp the hidden reason behind our most common screw-ups, and you'll hold the key to overcoming them. This is the story of the Checklist Manifesto. To really appreciate the power of a checklist, you need to understand what failure actually looks like. For most of human history, we failed because we simply didn't know stuff. We were ignorant. People died from minor cuts because we didn't understand infection. Buildings collapsed because we hadn't figured out earthquake engineering. Heart attack patients died on bed rest because we had no idea how to actually treat them. These failures were tragic, sure, but at least they made sense. You can't blame someone for not knowing something that hasn't been discovered yet. But somewhere in the last century, something shifted quietly. Science started filling in those gaps. Today, the World Health Organization has classified over 13,000 different diseases and injuries, and for almost all of them, we actually have solutions. We've got 6,000 drugs and 4,000 medical procedures at our disposal. The knowledge exists. We know how to prevent infections. We know how to treat heart attacks. We know how to build safe buildings. And yet, we still fail. But here's the twist. Our failures today are fundamentally different. We're not failing because we don't know. We're failing because we can't properly apply what we already know. That's called ineptitude. It's when the knowledge is sitting right there, but we somehow fail to use it correctly. It's the skyscraper that collapses, not because physics changed, but because someone built it wrong. It's the heart attack patient who doesn't get the right medication on time, not because the treatment doesn't exist, but because in the chaos of the emergency room, somebody missed a critical step. This is the defining problem of our modern world. We know so much that the sheer volume has overwhelmed our ability to deliver those benefits correctly, safely, and reliably. We train our experts, doctors, pilots, engineers, financial analysts, longer and more intensely than ever before. They're brilliant, skilled, dedicated people, but the amount of knowledge they're expected to juggle has become, frankly, impossible to manage perfectly every single time. Being an expert isn't enough anymore. Which brings us to a pivotal moment, October 30th, 1935. The U.S. Army Air Corps is holding a competition to pick its next long-range bomber. Boeing's new plane, the Model 299, is the obvious favorite. This thing is an engineering marvel, a gleaming, flying fortress that can fly faster, farther, and carry 5 times more bombs than the Army even requested. Everyone assumes the competition is just a formality. The Army's already planning to order dozens. A small crowd of Army brass watches as the plane taxis onto the runway. It roars down the tarmac, lifts off smoothly, and then, at just 300 feet, disaster strikes. The plane stalls, tips onto one wing, and crashes in a massive fireball. 2 of the 5 crew members die instantly, including the pilot, Major Ployer Hill, one of the most experienced test pilots in the entire Air Corps. The investigation reveals something shocking. Nothing mechanical failed. The crash was pure pilot error. This new plane was just so much more complex than previous aircraft. The pilot had to manage 4 engines instead of 2, plus retractable landing gear, new wing flaps, and about a dozen other systems. In the middle of juggling all that, he forgot one simple but crucial thing. He never released a new locking mechanism on the elevator and rudder controls. The verdict was brutal. One newspaper declared the Boeing model too much airplane for one man to fly. The Army gave the contract to the competing, simpler plane. Boeing nearly went bankrupt. But a small group of test pilots refused to give up on this plane. They believed it could work, so they got together to figure out a solution. And here's what's fascinating. What they decided not to do matters as much as what they did. They didn't demand more training. After all, the pilot who crashed was literally their chief of flight testing. You couldn't get more experience than that guy. Instead, they tried something brilliantly simple. They created a pilot's checklist. It was short enough to fit on an index card. Just step-by-step checks for takeoff, flight, landing, and taxiing. It was full of what looked like dumb stuff, simple reminders that any competent pilot should already know. Check that the brakes are released. Check that the instruments are set correctly. Check that the elevator controls are unlocked. Honestly, it didn't seem like it would make any real difference. But with that simple checklist in hand, the pilots flew the Model 299 for 1.8 million miles without a single accident. The Army was convinced. They eventually ordered nearly 13,000 of these planes, which became the legendary B-17 bomber that gave America a decisive advantage in World War II. The checklist wasn't replacing expertise, it was helping expertise actually succeed. Gawande calls it a cognitive net, a simple safety net to catch the mental flaws we all have, those little failures of memory, attention, and thoroughness, especially when we're under pressure. Now you might be thinking, sure, that works for airplanes, but my work is way more complex and unpredictable. And that's exactly what doctors thought for decades. They argued that sick people are infinitely more variable than airplanes. One study of trauma patients in Pennsylvania found 224 different injury types in over 32,000 unique combinations. How could you possibly create a checklist for that kind of chaos? But the idea slowly crept into medicine anyway, not from the top down, but from the ground up. Think about vital signs: temperature, pulse, blood pressure, respiratory rate. That's actually a checklist, and doctors didn't make it standard practice. Nurses, in the 1960s, designed their charts to ensure these four things got checked consistently. They understood that even if three signs look fine, that fourth one might reveal a hidden danger that could kill someone. Still, the idea of an actual doctor's checklist seemed unnecessary. That is, until 2001, when a critical care specialist at Johns Hopkins named Peter Pronovost decided to run an experiment. He wanted to tackle one specific deadly problem: infections from central lines. A central line is a catheter placed into a large vein in your neck, chest, or groin. ICUs insert 5 million of them every year in the United States alone, and they're absolute lifesavers. But they're also a major infection source. These infections kill patients up to 28% of the time. Pronovost knew there were 5 simple steps that could prevent most of these infections. Every doctor had learned these things years ago. 1. Wash your hands with soap. 2. Clean the patient's skin with antiseptic. 3. Put sterile drapes over the entire patient. 4. Wear a sterile mask, hat, gown, and gloves. 5. Put a sterile dressing over the site once the line is in. Making a checklist for something this obvious seemed almost insulting. But Pronovost first asked nurses in his ICU to observe doctors for a month and record how often they actually followed every single step. The results were shocking. In more than a third of patients, doctors skipped at least one step. So Pronovost did something revolutionary. He created a simple, one-page checklist with these 5 steps. Then he got the hospital administration to authorize nurses to stop doctors if they saw them skipping a step. This was huge culturally. It gave nurses actual permission and power to enforce the standard. For the next year, they monitored what happened. The results were so dramatic, they almost couldn't believe them. The 10-day infection rate dropped from 11% down to 0. They kept tracking for another 15 months. In that entire stretch, only 2 line infections occurred. This one simple checklist prevented an estimated 43 infections and 8 deaths in that hospital alone, saving them $2 million. This wasn't a fluke. When Pronovost and the Michigan Health and Hospital Association rolled out the checklist to ICUs across the entire state, the results were equally stunning. In the first 3 months, Michigan's ICU central line infection rate dropped by 66%. Over the first 18 months, the project saved an estimated $175 million and more than 1,500 lives. All because of what they called a stupid little checklist. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Because preventing a line infection is relatively straightforward, the steps are always the same. But what about messy, unpredictable, genuinely complex situations that define so much of our work? Can a checklist help when there's no simple recipe? For answers, Gawande takes us somewhere unexpected, a construction site. Standing on a Boston sidewalk, he watched a new 11-story hospital wing rising from the ground, a skeleton of steel beams reaching toward the sky, and he wondered, how can they be sure this thing won't collapse? The complexity of a modern skyscraper is mind-boggling. This hospital wing would require nearly 4,000 tons of steel, 13,000 yards of concrete, and 95 miles of electrical wire. 16 different trades, electricians, plumbers, masons, and more, all had to coordinate their work perfectly. How do you manage that? For most of history, buildings were created by master builders, a single genius who designed, engineered, and oversaw everything. They built Notre Dame and the U.S. Capitol, but by the mid-20th century, the master builder was extinct. The sheer variety and sophistication of knowledge required had overwhelmed any single person's capacity to master it all. The construction industry fragmented into dozens of specialties, just like medicine. But unlike medicine, the construction industry was forced to confront a harsh truth. Without a master builder, individual autonomy creates disaster. It produces a symphony of incompatible decisions and overlooked errors. It produces buildings that don't stand up straight. So they developed a different system. And at the heart of that system were checklists. At a construction site for a massive 32-story Boston complex, Gawande met the project executive, Finn O'Sullivan. On his conference room, walls hung two giant printouts. The first was the construction schedule, a line-by-line, day-by-day checklist of every single task that needed doing, in what order, and when. This was a classic do-confirm checklist, designed to handle complicated but predictable parts of the job. It made sure the basic but critical stuff didn't get missed. But the second checklist held the real secret. It was called the submittal schedule. This list didn't specify construction tasks. It specified communication tasks. The builders knew they couldn't predict every problem. A floor might tilt unexpectedly. A structural beam might conflict with planned lighting. Materials might arrive late. These are complex problems, unpredictable and uncertain. The medical approach to this is leaving it to the expert's individual judgment. But builders knew that was a recipe for disaster. Instead, their second checklist forced the right experts to talk to each other at critical moments. It specified who had to talk to whom, by what date, about what specific aspect of construction. It pushed decision-making power away from the center and out to the people on the front lines. It gave them freedom to adapt and use their expertise, but forced them to do it as a team. The philosophy was simple but profound. One person is fallible, but maybe a group is less so. They trusted in collective wisdom. This system has produced an astonishing success record. In the United States, we average just 20 serious building failures per year. That's an avoidable failure rate of less than 0.00002%, and they accomplish this while building faster than ever before. The checklists work. They handle both simple and complex challenges by balancing two seemingly contradictory ideas, discipline and freedom. Which brings us to the climax. Armed with this new understanding, Atul Gawande and his World Health Organization team returned to their daunting mission. Create a surgical checklist that could work anywhere in the world, from a high-tech Seattle hospital to a rural Tanzanian clinic. The process was painstaking. They borrowed principles from aviation and construction. They knew the checklist had to be short, simple, and practical. It couldn't be a detailed recipe. It had to be a tool helping experts function better as a team. The final WHO Safe Surgery checklist was a single page with just 19 checks, organized around 3 pause points. 1. Before anesthesia, the team confirms patient identity, correct surgical site, known allergies, and readiness for potential airway problems or major blood loss. 2. Before the first incision, this is the team huddle. Everyone introduces themselves by name and role. They confirm the patient and procedure again. Then, they talk. The surgeon outlines critical steps and potential dangers. The anesthesia team reviews their concerns. Nurses confirm all equipment is sterile and ready. This is the communication check. 3. Before the patient leaves the room, the team verbally confirms all sponges and instruments are accounted for, specimens are correctly labeled, and there's a clear recovery plan. To test if it would actually work, they launched a landmark study in 8 hospitals globally, representing huge diversity in wealth and resources. They had a university hospital in Seattle and a charity hospital in New Delhi, a major academic center in London, and a lone district hospital in rural Tanzania, serving nearly 1 million people. First, they collected 3 months of data without the checklist to establish a baseline. The results were sobering. Major complication rates hit 21% in some hospitals. They found basic safety steps were missed in a startling 2/3 of patients, in both rich and poor countries. Then, in spring 2008, the hospitals began implementing the 2-minute, 19-step checklist. The results came in a few months later. They were absolutely stunning. Across all 8 hospitals, major complication rates fell by 36%. Deaths fell by 47%. Infections dropped by almost half. The need for a second operation due to technical problems fell by 1/4. The checklist worked everywhere. In high-income hospitals, complications dropped by 1/3. In lower-income hospitals, they dropped even more. Overall, using the checklist spared more than 150 people from serious harm and saved 27 lives in just this small study. When staff were surveyed anonymously, 80% said the checklist was easy to use and improved safety, but the most telling number came from one final question. If you were having an operation, would you want the checklist used? A full 93% said yes. The ultimate test of a checklist, though, isn't in the data. It's in those moments when everything goes sideways. And for Gawande, that moment came in his own operating room. He was removing a rare tumor from a man's adrenal gland. Complex procedure, but one he'd done many times, without problems. He felt confident. Then, disaster struck. While dissecting the tumor, he accidentally tore a hole in the vena cava, the main vessel returning blood to the heart. It was, in his words, a catastrophe. His patient lost nearly his entire blood volume in about 60 seconds and went into cardiac arrest. Gawande had to slash open the man's chest and belly, take his heart in his hand, and manually pump it to keep blood flowing to the brain. He thought it was over. He thought he'd killed his patient. But they'd run the checklist at the start of the case. During the pre-incision huddle, Gawande had confidently stated he didn't expect much blood loss. But he also mentioned the tumor was near the vena cava, so major bleeding was theoretically possible. That was all the nurse needed to hear. She took it as her cue to double-check that blood was ready in the blood bank just in case it wasn't. So she made sure 4 units were prepared. That one simple step, prompted by the checklist, saved the man's life. But just as powerful was what the checklist did for the team. The operating room was filled with strangers who'd never worked together before. But because they'd gone around the room introducing themselves, because they'd taken a minute to discuss the plan as a team, when disaster hit, they didn't panic. They performed flawlessly. The nurse called for help and got the blood instantly. The anesthesiologist poured unit after unit into the patient. Everyone knew their role, and together they bought the surgeon and the patient precious time. The patient survived. Because of the checklist, he went home to his family. This is the power of the checklist. It's not some mindless bureaucratic tool. It's a tool for excellence. It's a way of instilling discipline, building teamwork, and ensuring we apply our vast knowledge with consistency and care. It catches our human fallibility. It gives us a fighting chance to get things right. When you first hear the central idea of the Checklist Manifesto, it can feel almost anticlimactic. A checklist? Really? We live in an age of artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and genetic engineering, and the secret to mastering complexity is basically a piece of paper with some boxes on it? But that initial skepticism is precisely why this book is so profound. The greatest discoveries are often hiding in plain sight. Atul Gawande didn't invent new technology. He revealed a new way of thinking. He shows us that in our quest for brilliance, we've often neglected the importance of simply being methodical. The book's most powerful lesson, for me, is about humility. The enemy of excellence isn't ignorance. It's the illusion of knowledge. It's believing that because we're experts, we're somehow infallible. The checklist forces us to confront our own fallibility. It forces the brilliant, experienced pilot to admit he might forget to unlock the rudder. It forces the world-class surgeon to admit that in the heat of the moment, he might overlook an allergy or forget an antibiotic. This isn't weakness. It's the ultimate professionalism. It's recognizing that the systems we work within matter more than our individual egos. The true hero of the modern age isn't the lone genius, the maverick breaking all the rules. It's the person who understands that success in a complex world requires both individual skill and the discipline to function as part of a team. It's Captain Sully Sullenberger, who in the middle of crisis trusted his training, his co-pilot, and his checklists. So how can you apply this in your own life? You don't need to be a surgeon or pilot to benefit from this idea. Here are a few simple ways to start. First, identify a recurring task in your life where mistakes happen. Could be something simple like packing for a trip, or something more complex, like completing weekly school assignments. We all have those, "Ugh, I forgot that again" moments. That's your target. Second, create a simple checklist for it. Don't try listing every single step. Remember what those Boeing engineers taught us. Focus on the killer items, the 5 to 9 most critical steps that are most dangerous to miss. Making sure your passport's in your bag? Double-checking the assignment due date? Write them down. Keep it on one page or a single note on your phone. Third, decide whether it should be read, do, or do confirm. For a recipe, you read, then do. But for many tasks, do confirm works better. You do the task from memory, then pause for 60 seconds to run through the list and confirm you didn't miss anything. The goal isn't turning you into a robot. It's the opposite. The checklist gets simple, boring, memory-based stuff out of your head, which frees up mental energy to focus on what really matters. The hard stuff, the creative stuff, the unexpected problems requiring your full intelligence. A checklist isn't about dumbing down work. It's about making space for smart work. That was the book summary of The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. We've certainly touched on the big ideas today, but a summary is like looking at a photograph of a mountain. Reading the book is like climbing it. The real power lives in the stories, the details, and the way Gawande makes you feel the weight of these life and death decisions. This summary is a map to help you decide if that climb is worth taking. If anything we've talked about today sparks something in you, I encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about gaining knowledge. It's an experience that can fundamentally change how you approach everything you do. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and keep growing together.